Okay. So here we go. Few last arrangements. Okay. So welcome again to everybody watching on Zoom, participating in this live recording, live meeting, and to everybody who may be watching on Facebook or watching this in the future on YouTube, for example. This is the 8th part of a series that I've called What Makes Our Inner Work Work? And what I'm actually trying to do throughout this series, and I don't know how long it might be in the end, is to look at my own life, look at my own inner work, and try to figure out and to explain what I think makes our inner work work and what doesn't. Okay, so each time I'm trying to look at it from a different angle, and today I've called this part 8. Don't criticize the inner critic. Don't kill the inner killer. And it's about, amongst other things, healing the living tissue of consciousness through non-polarizing inner work. So we'll talk about that soon. Now, last time in part 7, we spoke about the need, from my point of view, of being a bit of a rebel and a renegade if we want to break from our inner and outer barriers so that we can really expand our understanding, our consciousness, our vision, our realization of who we are. And what I talked about last time was one of the first steps that were sort of preparing me in a sense to another leap in my consciousness, in my abilities, in my understanding, and my experience of life and of myself and of what is possible too. And I must say that before this new phase that I've spoken about last time, about 15 years ago, I really couldn't even begin to imagine what would become possible for me. And from this, I deduce for humanity, for other people who are interested in that, in the following years. So it was a very important time for me. But today, we will talk about one of the most important things that I believe made this leap into a much wider field of consciousness. What made it relatively very safe and balanced for me, and I say that although things that happened later were sometimes pretty extreme. So I do believe that it's really, really important to build a good basis. And this is the topic of our conversation today. So building the basis for a healthy and balanced expansion and deepening. One of the things I find people often don't get enough and don't do enough in their inner work is to not do the work from a place of fighting, of criticism, and of judgment. Imagine ourselves as a sort of fabric, okay? As if our consciousness, just for now, and our life in general, imagine it as if it were a kind of fabric or web or even an embroidery. I also often like to use the word tissue, meaning, you know, like the tissues of the body, like our skin or things like that. So imagine for a moment our consciousness and our life and our entire field of consciousness as a kind of web or fabric or tissue. Okay? Now, if I start judging, criticizing, or trying to get rid of certain parts of this web, what usually happens, and these are all a bit, you know, slightly general things that need to be looked at more specifically. But if you imagine it like that, then imagine that you have certain inner parts in you that you are not happy with, okay, or that other inner parts don't approve of, okay, think they're wrong, immoral, dangerous, embarrassing, or anything else. And imagine that one such part, which we will now imagine as one thread in the web or in the fabric, tries to kill or to get rid of another such thread, okay? So this is actually what happens to us all the time. You know, it's not far-fetched at all. This is really, really what happens to all of us. For example, let's say I have a part of me that is very gentle, okay? And I have a different part, another part in me that is very worried about being gentle. Now, this other part, which might be a very tough part, or inner voice or self, may try, and this actually happens all the time, as you know, to eliminate the gentle part, okay? Now, at the same time, the gentle part may try to eliminate another part that isn't to its liking or worries it. And what actually happens in our life is that we're in this internal battle, constant battle. And of course, we are the ones that are the losers in this unending battle, because with our own hands, we keep tearing at ourselves, and we're causing all sorts of rifts within this fabric, which is us. And these rifts are between, for example, what I consider good and what I consider bad, what I consider healthy and what I consider unhealthy, what I consider acceptable and what I consider unacceptable, and so on. And not only that, it's also extremely influenced and determined by the society I am in, the family I grow in, and so on and so forth. So, for example, I can live in a society in where it is considered very, very bad to be impolite, okay? And so all the parts in me that are not polite will be considered bad or even evil sometimes. And there will be an effort to get rid of them, or to simply, they would simply be hated or despised, okay? So this is really what's going on within us. And this is also what's going on within humanity in general, where so many people cannot accept other kinds of people who are different from them. So that's, you know, banal but true. So if you think about this that way, you can start to see this embroidery that is us, or this fabric, or this tissue of consciousness, or this web. And you can see that it starts to become, instead of a beautiful fabric, it starts to become a war zone where different threads try to kill each other or get rid of each other. And sometimes they get warped and twisted, and the whole fabric becomes more and more twisted into a kind of knot, even, you know, like something that is very, very tense and constricted, and in general pretty miserable. So, you know, take a moment to see if this idea seems familiar to you. If you can, when you look at yourself, if you can see it, how you are fighting, and sometimes you're, to some degree, you're always on both sides, and you always lose, even when you win, especially when you win. Okay, so when we do our inner work from that, in that way, where, for example, we are trying to use all sorts of tools that we have to eliminate certain parts or certain threads of the fabric, this kind of work, from my point of view, simply doesn't work. And that's the best case scenario, that it doesn't work. The worst case scenario is that it causes damage and harm, which actually it does. So what I believe is a better way to do the work is to do it always in a non-judgmental, non-criticizing way towards whatever comes into our frame of consciousness, and to do everything in order to do the work in a way that is not increasing the polarization inside us. So the polarization is when we become polarized against a different part in ourselves, or when we become polarized against a different human being or country or religion or whatever. So if we really want our inner work to work, from my point of view, we need to figure out how to do it in a non-polarizing manner. And that's pretty tough, because we're extremely identified with all sorts of parts and voices in ourselves that say this part is horrible. And it's, you know, if anybody sees that you have an inner liar, you know, it's death, you know, or if anybody sees that sometimes you have inner sides that aren't generous, or that are even violent, or want to kill somebody, you know, it would be horrible. So there's also all this need to hide things all the time, both from others and from ourselves. And again, if I work from that point of view, trying to eliminate things and to kind of step on things and not honor whatever is there within me or within other people, then I'm really only creating more and more polarization and more rifts within myself, and more pain. really. So how do we go about doing it in a non-polarizing way? So first of all, I believe it's just getting the idea that we are what we are, first of all, and that just like I have 2 hands and 2 eyes and 2 ears and so on and so forth, and kidneys and lungs and the heart, then I have all sorts of parts within me, all sorts of selves, and that they're all, normal, that it's not pathological, that it's not a bad thing, and I don't need to get rid of anything. What I do need to do is to figure out how to stop being judgmental. Now, my judgment, from my point of view, is always originates in a certain self. As I said before, for example, if I feel judgmental towards violence, then it must be, from this point of view, another self that is perhaps a very peaceful self or a very kind or nice self that dislikes and judges violence. Okay, so when I do this work, for example, through voice dialogue, but however I do it, I really need to figure out where my judgment is originating from. Okay, and then I go and seek this part of me that judges, for example, a violent part. And I work with this part and I get to know it and I accept it. And little by little, I stop identifying with it. And once I stop identifying with it, I can then accept the other side, the violent part. Now, what happens when instead of being against a violent side, I can listen to it and I can stop the polarization and the tearing of the fabric? What happens is, first of all, that I become more aware of this side. That's number one. Another important thing is that I learn to accept it. I learn to understand its unique point of view. And I learn that when I accept it, it usually becomes less violent. That's what actually happens. It doesn't become, necessarily its opposite, and it doesn't need to become its opposite, because each and every part has a role and has a place in the fabric. Each thread is necessary for the fabric to be whole. But I don't want, of course, the violent part to take charge and to do whatever it wants, because then I will be identified with it, and I would be, apart from being violent towards myself and other people, I would probably be against other selves that the violent part dislikes. Okay, so this is kind of voice dialogue in a nutshell. And voice dialogue is kind of one of the things that are part of what I now call Flowering Diamond Way. Okay. Now, why am I telling all this? After all, I've spoken about voice dialogue for over 20 years now, with others, and with myself for over 30 years. So why am I going back to it? Because when you do a lot of voice dialogue, and I mean do, not think about it or read about it, but actually do it, what happens is a few things, a few very important things. First of all, little by little, by working with opposing parts, but in a non-polarizing way, so I don't identify with one against the other or vice versa. By doing this, little by little, there emerges a state of consciousness, or you could call it a process, that I call the aware I. So this is, it's a complicated concept, which we won't go into now, but it's amongst other things, it's Ora when she's aware and living actively from this awareness and choosing and doing things from this awareness and not from any self. Okay, we're going there. You know, it takes years of practice naturally, but each step on the way is very, very important. So this process or this state of consciousness that I call the aware I, little by little becomes more and more active, and it's there more and more of the time. And this is an extremely balancing thing, because instead of being in a kind of seesaw movement between opposing sides, identifying with this and then identifying with that, or being identified with one side against the other and attacking the other, and then feeling the pain of the other part because it's being attacked and nobody loves it, and so on and so forth. Instead of that, it becomes more and more like an opening, a very organic and gradual opening, like a flower. And just imagine this, you know, this opening as something that creates a very stable base from which to continue, you know. So instead of, for example, if this is the flower, instead of kind of having only some of the petals open, you know, like this, I get more and more gradually of the petals open, and I'm not identified with any of them because I accept all of them, but they don't rule me. They don't kidnap me, you could say, okay? And I'm in the aware I. So I believe, if to return to the beginning of this meeting, that the fact that for many, many years I did this basic work with my inner selves, discovering more and more of them, so that they won't kidnap me, and so that I won't be in the state of constant inner conflict that most people live in, whether they are aware of it or not. So doing all this work enabled me to stabilize my system. And the more it becomes stable, the more you can then fly very high, very far, or dive very deep on that basis without, you know, for example, losing contact with the ground, which happens to many people who go into spirituality, or without becoming polarized into spirituality, which is also not a very healthy thing to do when it happens. If you become, for example, like it happens to some people, not everybody, who does a lot of spiritual work, that they sometimes become polarized, sorry, and judgmental against things that are considered materialistic, okay, or against their bodies, or against sexuality, or against their instincts, and other things too. So I really believe that in order to progress into spirituality, whatever it means to you right now, it's very, very useful and very advisable to do this inner work with your inner selves as much as possible, before, during, and forever. You know, it never ceases to be useful, and you become stronger and stronger the more you do it, more and more empowered, more and more stable, and then you can take more risks in a way, but do it in a way that is wise, and not, you know, just foolish and dangerous. Okay. Now, part of doing this work, as you probably all realize, has to do with finding, agreeing to see, and accepting and doing work with parts that can be pretty dark. Okay. That's what, for example, Jung called the shadow, amongst other things. Dark aspects of ourselves, and what is dark for one person is not necessarily dark for another. But think about, for example, the inner killer. Okay, I think quite a lot of people would consider that dark, and I want to know my inner killer. I don't want my inner killer to be invisible to me and to, you know, kind of perhaps do all sorts of stuff in the background without me realizing it, or to cause me to project my inner killer on somebody else or on a different culture, you know, which is really, really bad for humanity and for our world in general. So in, I think it was around 98, I was writing a novel at that time, and the novel also included little bits of, I don't know how to call them exactly. Sometimes it's really small poems, sometimes it's other things. And I want to read you one of these things that I wrote then that was really one way of looking at this need to heal the inner rifts and to accept everything that is in us instead of being scared of it and running away from it all the time, which is actually running from ourselves all the time. So this little poem is called The Shadow's Complaint. The Shadow's Complaint. You say I am your shadow, yet you follow me, your guide to lands of mystery. I stop to point the sights and clarify the history. You blindly knock me down, flinch, dart away, as if you've seen your ghost. But lover, as we spring together from one root, however fast you run, you find me underfoot. So the shadow, which we tend to run away from, and all the parts and selves in us, which we try not to see and are afraid to accept as our own. Here it's like a lover, and the meeting is really a very, very happy occasion. There were a few years in which I taught a course that I called The Journey Home. And this course had to do mainly with finding and accepting our dark sides, our dark selves. And we went through all sorts of dark parts in ourselves and did the work in order to accept them as legitimate parts of the whole fabric. We went through things like killers and sadistic parts and stupid parts and autistic parts and, you know, all sorts of things. And of course, depressed parts too. And the wonderful thing about this course, which was extremely enjoyable, was to see how people would, even if they came a little bit worried to this course, after each meeting with such a dark self, they would be so happy, so invigorated and so enlivened, because meeting these dark selves is a very, very joyful thing. It's extremely freeing. It makes us more and more complete and whole. It makes us more balanced. It makes us more alive. It makes us more, I said complete and whole, I think. It really returns us to this unpolarized situation, which is so blessed. So building this as well as you can then fly very, very far indeed. And in our in the meetings to come, I will try to talk both about these very basic things for me, and also to talk about flying very far. So we'll see how this works. We're going to finish this part for now, and we'll meet in a few seconds for the second part, in which, if you'd like, you can ask things, you can comment, and so on and so forth. Okay, so see you in a second. And thank you very much for being here with me. 1 second.